Hi, I'm Gordon Draper, and I'm the host of the Cyber Consulting Room podcast. Today I have an interview I recorded with Chris Howes, who is a GRC expert from Mercury Information Security Systems, while we were at B-Sides Canberra 2024 InfoSec conference. We go into detail about governance, risk and compliance, covering key topics for businesses when implementing an information security management system. But before we run that interview, let's have a word from our sponsor, cybermarket.com.
Cyber threats are real. Are you prepared? Finding the right cybersecurity consultant can be a daunting task. Trust and quality are paramount. Introducing cybermarket.com, the solution to your cybersecurity hiring needs. We've done the hard work for you. Our consultants are pre-vetted, certified, and trusted by industry professionals. Ready to elevate your security? Visit cybermarket.com and find the perfect consultant for your needs. Your cybersecurity assured. Hi, I'm Gordon Draper, and I'm the host of the Cyber Consulting Room podcast. Today, I've got Chris Howes, the Principal Governance, Risk and Compliance Consultant with Mercury Information Security Systems. Hi, thank you for joining us today.
That's right. Thanks for having me on.
Awesome. So you're principal of GRC at Mercury. What is your background and how did you get into cybersecurity?
So how I got into it, it's sort of through the highways and byways of life. So primarily my background is banking finance.
Mm-hmm.
So doing basically risk compliance and governance work over with Big Four banking. And through that, I'm a reservist with the Australian Defence Force, which is where I met Ed, who's my current boss.
Cool.
And the owner of Mercury. And basically through the highways and byways, we were undergoing a bit of a merger and acquisition. And so I was looking for a bit of a change. I already had a background in things like PCI, DSS, as well as a lot of the other standards. And so Ed said, why don't you come on over and see if you can try doing a bit of purist cybersecurity consulting. So over I came and started helping the team out.
Very nice. So did you have a university degree? How did you get into GRC?
Interestingly, no. So I've more gone down a bit more of the routes of certificates. So I've currently got a CISM and a CISA, and I'm also an ASD endorsed RF assessor.
Oh, very good.
So more went down that route. But a lot of what I've done has been through sort of on-the-job style of training.
Mm-hmm.
Did also go to TAFE and do a bit of networking, so get a bit of that generalized background, because usually one of the most important things is just how everything talks together.
Yeah, it helps to have the technical components as well as the GRC controls and know exactly what they are and what they can do.
It does make it easier, particularly when you're trying to implement things and give recommendations. It does make it a heap easier.
Very good. So what advice would you have for people starting out and getting into cybersecurity, and how would they get into GRC if that was the path that they wanted to take?
If they were really interested in it and really wanted to join the GRC world, I think having a good background and understanding of the different standards that are out there is probably a good starting point. Similarly, I'd say having a good understanding of just how a business operates, and even a bit of a background in risk and understanding what risk is and how it is tracked and managed would probably give them a really good start and a good grounding in it.
Yeah, I like to think of risk as the language of business, especially in the financial services.
Absolutely. It's basically a universal language that kind of everyone is able to speak, which is rather nice.
Very good. So I guess the next question would be, how would you define GRC? And how would you explain why it's essential for organizations of all sizes?
Okay, so GRC, as I sort of said, is governance, risk, compliance. So it's a blending of three separate but also interrelated domains. So you've got the governance side of it, which is more, I guess, the guiding and strategic direction of a business. So how you keep eyes over everything and keep everything tracking in the right direction. You've then got risk, which I'm really bad at regurgitating textbook definitions, but my own definition would be it's more the possibility that something may happen or occur. And a big confuser with risk is a lot of people always think it's negative. You can sometimes have positive risk. So for example, you go to the casino when you win, you have taken a risk, but if you win, you've actually made a gain. So there are pluses and minuses to the risk game. And then finally, compliance, which is more where you get things like government standards and just basically there's a set of rules and how do you go with complying with them.
Yeah. So would you say that they commonly refer to this sort of compliance as a bit more of a checkbox mentality, as a common name for it? You're complying to the regulations, so that makes sense. So you need to check to make sure that you are, or maybe even be audited to make sure that you are compliant with the regulations and and standards that you're following. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Perfect. You're the expert, so I'm coming to you for advice on these sorts of things.
On compliance, yeah. Compliance is a tricky one, though, because a lot of people do say, have I checked the box? But what you kind of discover and what can get really hard is those boxes are very grey and quite nebulous sometimes. So a lot of the regulations, for example, with TFNs, when I used to have to deal with those, it was really a lot around, they use words like at an appropriate time or when relevant. Though when relevant and when appropriate are very individual and subjective. So a lot of with the compliance stuff is more would be understanding your context and then basically going through and saying, okay, I need to comply with this rule based on my context. Most appropriate would be X time. And honestly, with the compliance, it's more about having a rationale and a reason for why you've done something the way you've done it, than potentially ticking a box. Because if you just try to tick a box, potentially you might actually miss one of the core foundational things of what you're trying to do.
Yeah, there's definitely an argument for pushing back on a checkbox mentality. If you it's compliance for compliance sake, as some people say, and so it's to me it seems like an idea that you're not necessarily applying cybersecurity to everything. You're ticking a box to make sure that you're compliant and so the overall effect of security may be lost. That's the ideal is that it does achieve what you're trying to do, but in some cases it can be lost down the path of, yes, you've effectively met your requirements from a compliance perspective, but overall, are you actually achieving what you're trying to do?
Yeah, are you actually protecting what needs to be protected? And look, it does get hard because with the GRC thing, a lot of people see it as something of a detractor. Like, oh, we've got the risk people coming in again and they're going to say no. We'll say you need to do all these other things. And somewhat similar for compliance, like the auditors coming, therefore doom is coming along with them, those sorts of things. But if it's done properly and it's done correctly, you really should be a business enabler. And a lot of it should be keeping an idea of what the actual goal of the business is and what they're trying to achieve at the center of it. Because it is hard, because controls are also very expensive by and large. So if you want to take it simpler to paying for something like a Microsoft Defender or some other sort of SOC or SIEM type service, that carries with it a cost. But again, some people go wild and say everyone needs a SOC and everyone needs a SIEM and everyone needs this, that, and the other. Depending on the business context, it might not be the most appropriate. You've just really got to consider that and think through, and don't just tick a box to say, yep, I've got a SOC and a SIEM, thanks. Because depending on your context, you really have to get it dialed in for your business for it to actually be valuable.
Yeah, I like to think of controls needing to be tuned and having the people involved with to tune those controls to be optimum performance.
Yeah, it has to be achieving an outcome. So the way we normally try and look at it is you've got the design effectiveness of it and the operational effectiveness. So when you set out to design a control, you actually look at what do I need it to achieve? What's this control actually supposed to do? And then once you've designed it properly, you then need to go and check on it and make sure it's actually working the way as intended. And potentially that does involve a little bit of tweaking. But yeah, you absolutely need to make sure that at the outset, you're really considering why you need that control and what it's got to be doing.
Yeah, my thought process is a web application firewall. Yes, you've got a web application firewall, but have you put the rules in appropriately to be the right standard and the right sensitivity?
Yeah, defaults are not always the best option.
Secure by default. That's another goal of Caesar in the US. So not just secure by design, but secure defaults, which a lot of organizations, service providers, sort of like cloud, for example, they don't necessarily come in the most secure default state.
No, which is the difficulty, because again, they're just designed for everyone. So you get this sort of out of the box, fairly generic thing. And it really is that you've got to actually go and really consider what it does and how it works and kind of build out from there. They do very much come in a generic state.
Oh, there's a whole business associated with guardrails for cloud, so there's room for opportunity for some organizations.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what would you say how does governance, risk, and compliance work together to improve an organization's cybersecurity posture?
Yeah, so on the whole, it's sort of those three broad areas all coming together to help the business. So we sort of talked about a little bit already, but it's about you should be an enabler. So when we talk about governance, you've often got sort of senior management, board, executives, and the like, and really they've got the accountability. So they need to have some way to actually look across what might be a really big business, what might be a really small business, but be able to have some way of showing that they're keeping track of things and that they have an idea of what's going on and that things are secure. And so like for banking, for example, within Australia, you've got the Banking Executive Accountability or BEAR regime. And basically banking executives are accountable. And if they're not actually having the appropriate level of governance and visibility across the organization and meeting all of their requirements, there's fines and potential jail terms. So governance for them is absolutely critical because they need to have an idea of what's going on within their business. And then sort of risk and compliance, they're a little bit related to sort of the governance and the keeping an eye across everything. But from a risk perspective, from a business standpoint, it's really about understanding what are my opportunities and what potentially am I facing into from a risk perspective, be that potentially a threat actor, or even something like natural environment disasters, et cetera, and being able to have an understanding of, right, these are the risks that I face. What controls have I got in place? How do I control that or even avoid it entirely? And what does that mean for my business? And then compliance is, in some areas, you just have to comply with requirements. So you've got GDPR, for example, is quite a big one. Privacy is a bit of a hot topic at the moment. So what does that mean, given we're beaming more and more of our information out into the ether? How do you actually stay secure in an ever-increasingly interconnected environment? We're going to likely see more government standards and regulations coming in. So it's a bit of an understanding of, does my business have any of these requirements and regulations? What do they mean? And what do I have to do to meet them? And again, if you can get a good GRC person to come in, have a look across all of those, and then build out a bit of a plan of, this is what it all means, this is how you need to comply, get an understanding of the controls that you need, and then have a good way of tracking and mapping those to make sure that, one, they're still meeting all the requirements, and that two, they're actually remaining cost effective and not detracting from you being able to actually conduct your business, then that's really how GRC is going to help you.
You discuss a risk appetite within that as well, from the sounds of it.
Yes. So everyone kind of needs a RAS and an idea of what risk is appropriate to them. So again, what I might think may be a reasonable risk, like if I want to gamble $100, maybe that's okay for me and that's within my risk appetite. But another person may say that $100 is way too much. They'd never go more than $5. And that just really depends on what it is that you're comfortable with potentially putting out there and losing. But then again, that comes with sort of an equalish reward, potentially, if you put it out there. So yeah, each business does need to sit down and decide how much risk is appropriate for them based on their context and based on how much they're potentially able to lose, and even reputationally, how much they can survive.
Yeah, I saw one risk management framework at an organization that had 7 different categories of risk and metrics, risk levels associated with each of those categories: financial, reputational, even health and safety and personnel. So it was there's a lot of areas that you can have risk in, including technology and cyber. So it's a very interesting area, the whole risk component as well.
Yeah, I mean, well, cyber in itself is one risk, and you can kind of bundle under technology. You can slice it a lot of different ways. And I think that is sometimes the tricky part with risk is you might want to focus on personnel, you might want to focus on reputation. Often you will see those 5x5 matrices with your high, medium, and lows, and then you might have different subcategories that spear off under that. it really is just, it depends. And it depends on what's important to you and how you want to try and manage what risks you have. And so if that particular business was, concerned with their people, concerned with health and safety, privacy might have been another one. It's another way of managing it.
Definitely. So what are some of the most commonly used GRC frameworks? I was just talking about an example of a risk framework that some organization had set up. What some examples of commonly used GRC frameworks, and what are the benefits and challenges when adopting these frameworks?
So from some of the cyber perspective, some of the common ones you'll see is your NIST frameworks. You'll see a lot of the ISO ones, so the ISO 27001 is another pretty common one. From some of the work that I do, you see a lot of the Australian Government's Information Security Manual. And potentially one of the more approachable ones is also the ACSC's Essential 8, which is another good one to look at. That one's a little bit more of like controls and focusing more on incident mitigation and management. But yeah, those are some of the common ones that we run across quite regularly.
So what would be the benefit of applying a ASD Essential 8 apart from some requirements in some government organizations that they would be mandated to use it? But for a private organization, what would be some of the benefits of using something like the ASD Essential 8?
So the EA, it's fairly approachable in that it's not necessarily 8 controls, but it's 8 overall areas and domains that you would look at. So it's things like identity management. You have in there some generalized system hardening that you would use. I'm trying to remember some of the other ones off the top of my head.
Whitelisting, patch management.
Yeah, patch management.
For both the operating system and the applications.
Yep. There's a couple of different domains in there, but then they've got sort of controls that sit under each of those and things that you've got to have implemented. So it gives you a pretty good roadmap, and it's not very ambiguous, which is also really nice. So it is quite understandable and quite approachable. Whereas if you've got something like ISO 27001, for example, there's a lot of things like the organization needs to have context and have an overall document that sets out this is the context of the organization, and therefore this is going to be the ISMS's context. That can be quite a journey to go through depending on size and complexity of the business. There's a fairly heavy documentation requirement. And there's also, you've got to go through each of the individual clauses as well as the overall Annex A, which has all the individualized controls for each of the clauses. So it can get quite big. And if you've not really had too much exposure to something like that before, it can be a little bit difficult to go through and implement and just roll that out. Particularly if you're a smaller to medium sort of size business, it might not make as much sense to go down that road. So the ACSC is just a lot more approachable, and it's another easier way to just sort of say, yep, I've got these controls in place. I've got my eyes over them. So therefore I've got my governance. I understand my risk in relation to all of these, and therefore I can carry forward. And at least you've got something, which is always better than nothing.
What would you say some of the challenges would be to implementing that? The documentation for ISO 27001 framework. NIST 853, for example, is a controls library for the NIST related frameworks. That's very onerous.
Yep, can be. Absolutely be. I think a lot of the challenges that we've recently seen is, it was sort of similar to what we were talking about with the ticker box mentality. So I was talking to someone about this the other day, was in a Linux-based environment, for example, how do you do the Essential 8? Because when you start to really dive into those controls, they're a little bit Microsoft-y in terms of their flavor. And really what it comes down to there is looking at the intent of the control. So not so much reading the exact words and be like, yep, I've done those exact words, so therefore everything is perfect. It would more be, okay, in your Linux environment, what can you put in place that broadly meets the intent of? Maybe it's like whitelisting or application control. Can you put some kind of daemon in there that's actually going to achieve the effect that the controller is aiming? And it's a similar sort of thing with the NIST and the ISO as well. And you can run into challenges where people haven't necessarily understood the context of the control correctly, and they haven't necessarily got the overall intent. And so that's normally the difficulty we run into with everybody is, what's the intent of the control? What is it that you're actually trying to achieve? And then that will inform on the outcome. And the control that you have may not be a one-for-one for the exact wording of the individual control, but the idea is that you're achieving the overall effect as intended. That's usually where we run into issues.
There's some potential gaps that can appear if you're once again down the, I've taken the exact wording, I've effectively ticked a box. Yeah. That's definitely some interesting challenges for implementation of these frameworks. So how can organizations tailor these frameworks to fit their unique requirements and risk profile?
Well, yeah, sort of all of those things. So looking at your organization's context. So are you a plumbing business? And are you selling plumbing supplies online? That's going to be one thing. Or are you a large financial organization? Whilst those two companies will likely have some sort of cybersecurity type requirement, how they approach it and what their crown jewels are probably going to be a little bit different. And so where I say crown jewels, that's your most important thing within your network. So be it maybe some bank accounts or something like that, or be it a list of customer names from a privacy perspective. Realistically, the most important thing to consider is your crown jewels and what's most important. So what are you actually trying to protect? And then who you're trying to protect it from. I was trying to think. So then from tailoring it from there, it would really be taking those controls and those frameworks and, again, understanding what is it the framework is actually trying to get me to do? What is the end goal and the intent of it? And then tailoring that to both your environment and what it is that your organization is trying to achieve. So you can sometimes cripple yourself with compliance. So I'd say take that overall requirement, really look at what is it that these controls are trying to get me to do? Am I trying to keep intruders out? Am I trying to protect privacy? Am I trying to meet a standard, for example? Then go and look at, okay, what are my crown jewels? Where are they located? Who are my potential threat actors, or who might actually be trying to intrude into my network? And then from there, build out your controls. So it really starts with understanding your network and what's important to you, going and looking at your potential threats, who your threat actors are, and then basically risk and controls off the side of that.
And obviously then associated with profiling it to both the potential threat actors that could be targeting your organization, as well as the risks associated with and the controls that you're potentially mitigating these risks from these threat actors. That makes perfect sense. And so then you tailor it to, so say if you've got a financial services organization that deals with money and bank accounts, or the financial payroll system might be you need to protect that so that someone doesn't come in and instantly can submit a transfer of bank funds, for example. That makes perfect sense.
Yeah, exactly. And it's one of those things, and you've even got to consider insider threat, which we're seeing sort of more and more lately as well. That's a really difficult one because everyone likes to think that, sorry, that sounds really harsh, but yeah, everyone trusts their employees because there is an implicit trust there, but there is a difficulty where we've seen people doing interesting things like taking a USB in and then storing it in their sock and walking out the door and doing funny things. It's just one of those sort of ones. But yeah, you really need to understand what your threat is and tailor the sort of your risk assessment and therefore your controls to your needs. So similarly, the ticker box, you can't just say, I've got this framework, here's a whole bunch of stuff, everything's going to be perfect. You really have to consider your context and tailor everything.
Definitely. Insider threat is becoming more and more, as you potentially have disgruntled employees, they might go onto the dark web and sell their username and password and multi-factor token, so that a bad actor comes in from a different location in the world and wreaks havoc, and they're just a disgruntled employee. It's not condoning it at all, obviously, but there's more and more of these risks of insiders. I know it's harsh to think you can't necessarily trust. It's not that they're workers, not suspects, but they're employees. There's a potential path with a risk. You'd have a likelihood and a impact. And so, like in some of those situations, is the CFO likely to be transferring money to somewhere that a scammer has said that they're the CEO and accidentally transferred funds out of the company.
And look, possibly, and it is just one of those things, and it is sort of harsh to say, but I guess the word zero trust gets thrown around quite a bit, and having zero trust environments, and unfortunately that does need to extend to having zero trust in people. So I guess within the banking land, we have what's called toxic combinations, which may not be too wide or too common at this point in time, but it's really looking at those people that have abilities to not only put a transaction into the system, but also authorize it. So that's potentially a toxic combination because that gives the ability to commit fraud. And so often you'll see a lot of that role segmentation. So having one person that's the enterer and then a separate person that's approver to try and stop those things, which is pretty common in the financial circles. But yeah, I mean, with cost of living as well and other pressures out there, you do see a lot of threat actors potentially leaning on people with money and saying, yeah, potentially if you're willing to do this for me or give us access to this or that, we'll give you this money. And sometimes that's just how it goes. And it is really, really hard. And from a controls perspective, it's a difficult thing to control because how exactly do you mitigate that? It's definitely a challenging thing.
The common comment that people are your weakest link from clicking on things and accidentally putting a username and password into the wrong website is commonly what it's referred to, but also people they're not a hard technological control. They're soft and human.
Yeah, people make mistakes. I mean, that's why phishing is so insidious, because it really is very simple to double click on that document that someone sent you that you didn't really know what it was. So you're opening it anyway just to see it, and then the game's already over at that point. It's just really, really challenging.
Yeah, very tough, very tough. So what are some effective methods for identifying and assessing cybersecurity risk? Recently I've had pen testers on the podcast, and I talked about how pen testing is a form of identification for vulnerabilities. What other things can organizations do for identifying and assessing cybersecurity risks?
Yeah, so pen testing is a good one. That does give you a bit of a proactive approach to understanding what might be out there in your environment. Some other good ones that you can do with things like your architecture reviews. So actually going through or even getting an expert to come and look over the way that your system is interconnected and designed and understanding what that potentially means from sort of an access and authentication perspective. So I guess the common one is a flat network. If your network is flat, then potentially you are accepting quite a bit of risk there. Whereas if you've got a DMZ and you've got a bit of segregation around it, splitting things out, that really quite helps. So if you actually, from time to time, pull out your network maps, have a bit of a look over it, that can help you identify potential risks. Similarly, keeping an eye on the various softwares that you are using. So it's becoming pretty common now to have software bills of material coming out to be able to look at for potentially a piece of software that you're consuming, who the various software vendors are and what risks are associated with them, particularly from vulnerabilities and discovered bugs kind of perspective. That's another really good one. Another good one is threat mapping as well. So again, looking over your environment and just doing even a bit of a tabletop exercise. So, okay, here's what the environment looks like. Where are my sort of touch points with things like the internet? What gateways have I got? Where could an actor potentially come in from? It's another good way to identify risks. The other one is tabletop exercises. It's more of an incident response kind of thing. But again, you can look for weaknesses and risks in your environment and in the way that you respond. And even sometimes you can find areas of oversight that you're potentially missing from a monitoring perspective. And yeah, those are a couple of good ways you can actually identify.
They're very good ones. I had a discussion with someone about tabletop exercises, and there's simple ones such as backdoors and breaches cards from Black Hills Information Security, and it teaches you the combinations that they give you the building blocks that you need to be able to map out a scenario that you can take to a tabletop exercise. And I've certainly prepared some in the past where we've a tabletop exercise is an interesting discussion point as well, because it can go right up to the board and where they're being called in for an exercise for an hour, half an hour to have a look at the roles and the responsibilities that they have to take and the decisions that they would have to take in the case of a day-long or a 2-day-long tabletop exercise. So that's definitely an interesting space there.
It is. And they are quite good. And in some cases, they can be quite confronting for the poor board, particularly if they're not, I guess I'll use the word cyber savvy. The moment that it's just like, you've got to make a decision. Do you want to enact a BCP? Do you want to just try and limp along? What do you want to do? And in some cases, like, for example, a lot of people are in the cloud at the moment. And therefore, we're in the cloud, so everything's fine. We never lose the cloud. But if you look at things like some of the more recent outages that have occurred, sometimes the cloud does go down occasionally. And if you've not got sort of your multi-regions set up, and if you're not set up to actually recover quickly, if you haven't got all of your configs saved down and in a safe offline place, so you can't store your cloud configs just in the cloud, because then you've got all your eggs in the one basket. So try and keep an offsite copy or something somewhere safe. Some of them discover that you actually don't have the ability to recover, which can be really interesting. It can be a bit confronting by the board, because it's like, we paid all this money for a cloud. Why isn't it permanently there? So it can actually be quite good.
There was one organization in Australia where their cloud provider misconfigured it, and after a couple of years, it literally just deleted itself. So everything at that cloud provider for that company's tenancy, that organization, was gone, and there was no backups associated with that. So that they struggled for a few weeks to a month trying to work out how we're going to recover this. And it turns out it was because they had multi-cloud risk strategy, and so they did actually have some backup components in multi-cloud, another cloud, so they could they effectively were able to recover. But wow, what a roller coaster that would have been.
That would have been stressful. Yeah, I would have been stressed. And it's hard, right? Because you made a choice and you thought it was all fine, and you left it with the cloud provider, but sometimes it doesn't happen. And again, looking at the risk side, we also suggest people do things like looking at the shared responsibility model, and just understanding when it comes down to backup, who's ultimately going to be accountable, and it is your data. So you've got to make sure you know where it is and how you're going to get it back if ever anything happens to it.
That's right. It's not someone else's responsibility to do the backups for you, unless you're employing them to do that.
Well, that's it. I mean, we do have the fun old adage of you can outsource responsibility, but you can't outsource accountability. So
very good.
At the end of the day, who's got to do it?
That's exactly right. So there's some very good examples of how to identify different cybersecurity risks. Can you discuss some effective strategies for mitigating cybersecurity risk?
It really depends on the risk, but like some of the ones we just talked about. So the risk to your data, and particularly potentially its availability. If it were to have a cloud outage or things like that, having a multi-cloud strategy, or even having a strategy of maintaining some offsite backups, or even just some on-prem backups if you need to, just so you can mitigate potential losses in the cloud, and sort of vice versa. Even if you're fully on-prem, you might want to have a small cloud backup to try and keep some of your data there. That's often a good one. I mean, the things we normally look at are confidentiality, integrity, and availability with those sorts of things. So it's really considering what the risk is and then what you can potentially do to mitigate it. So if you're looking at intrusion into your network, having detection available, so whether that be a SIEM type scenario, or if you want to have something like Defender or CloudWatch, things like that, to actually keep an eye on your environment. Those are some other good ones. It's really going to be dependent on what the risk is and then what it is that you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, it sounds like it'd be for each risk, there'd be a mitigation tailored to that risk.
Generally, yes. And that's sort of the tricky bit when people start to approach it, is if you've got a million risks, what do you do? But again, I'd probably suggest come back to something like threat mapping, understand what the threat is, associate a risk with that. So with risk, we'd normally look at what the likelihood of a potential intruder to get in is, and then how bad is it going to be if they do get in? And then you can work on controls from there. So if you've got APTs are a bad example because they're just a little bit hard. But if you've got internet exposed architecture and if you're sort of thinking about, okay, are we going to have potentially something like a script kiddie that's just going to try and come in and mess with our website? And well, okay, what are some things that you can do to actually mitigate the risk there? So looking at controls that you could actually, limit the ability of someone to actually query the website, query backend servers, things like that, make sure that they can't go and pull any information out and just keep everything as blank as possible.
So blank as possible with regards to the accessibility from the script kiddie's perspective.
Yeah. So when they're trying to put in potentially code to get a response back, so making sure that you're not actually giving them usable responses. So anything that they can use to further enumerate the environment.
Yes, that's a common scenario with regards to script kiddies. So pen testers are highlighted as from the enumeration protection perspective, definitely.
Yeah.
So how can organizations balance their risk tolerance with risk appetite?
Risk tolerance and risk appetite. So those are sort of two interconnected ideas, but really everyone's going to have their own level of risk appetite and how much they're willing to accept. And when balancing it, it's really going to come down to potential cost and benefit. So you've got the risk appetite itself with just how much risk are we willing to take on in an area. And then you've got to have a little bit of tolerance either way there. And so it's really looking at, for any given risk, you're going to have controls in place to manage that particular risk normally, assuming it's either within appetite or outside of appetite. So a lot of people say if you've got something like a high risk, most of the things that we see is everyone will generally accept a medium level of risk. And then higher above, they're trying to put some sort of mitigation in place to try and either reduce the likelihood or the impact of it. So the other thing you'd have to consider is what is the cost to actually do that and to actually control that risk? Because if the cost just starts to keep blowing out and out and out, there is the possibility that in trying to control that risk, you've actually completely mitigated any actual potential benefit that you gain by conducting business in that area. And then potentially really look at, do you need to be operating in that domain? If the risk is so high and the level of control that you require is so high, is there actually any point? And I think that's one to really keep in mind. It's looking at, what's the potential benefit?
I did a security risk assessment for a piece of software from China. And for this large organization, what would they be? Would they like to have this technology, this program, on their computers in China? And what would the risk? What were the risks and impacts? And it ended up being that there was a backdoor in the software that allowed remote access to anyone. And it would seem to be only in the Chinese region that this was occurring. And from there, likewise, you've got network controls and associated with, could a bad actor get onto one of these devices in the laptop in China, and is that connected back to the rest of the global network for this large organization? And I had to turn around and say, look, I found this. I've given this a pretty high risk rating associated with it, because you're giving them access to not just the laptop, but also potentially the network, where the protection of sensitive data for that organization, where you don't really want any bad actor inside the network at all. So the backdoor was a serious find. I didn't make a lot of friends that really, really wanted to do business in China, but it's an identification component.
Well, which is hard, right? And it is. The pen testing and the security reviews always do give you a lot of insight. And it is one of those things, right? Because there is obviously a benefit that China has a huge market there. I'm sure a lot of people really want to jump in on it, but were they willing to accept something like a backdoor?
It's the appetite and the tolerance associated with that.
Just what are they willing to accept? Maybe later I have to ask you if they actually were willing to tolerate that, because I'd be fascinated to know.
I found out later on that they put in other controls in place, such as putting it into a virtual environment on the laptop. and locking it down.
All right, that's probably a good call.
So they put another layer on top.
Yeah, okay. But it always good. And it is just a tension between just how much am I willing to accept and what am I actually willing to tolerate happening in reality.
So what are speaking of compliance and regulations around the world, what are some key cybersecurity regulations that organizations need to be aware of? We're in Australia, so some ones probably relevant to Australian organizations would be appropriate, but this podcast goes globally, and we do have listeners from around the world listening. So anything that you can recommend?
So it may not be necessarily cyber per se, but privacy is always a big one to look at. So from an Australian perspective, we have the Australian privacy principles, for example. Over in Europe, you've got things like GDPR. And whilst it's not necessarily cyber, we're seeing a lot more things like data breaches coming out to the forefront. So I'd say privacy is an ever-increasing area of regulation. I know in Australia it's being looked at again, and potentially we're going to see maybe something like GDPR coming in Australia possibly in the future. But you've also got the IIC, so the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner. Got a lot of powers there as well, some fairly heavy fines involved with data breaches. So that's always an important one. From a governmental perspective, you've got things like the Information Security Manual, as well as the Essential 8, and their compliance requirements that go along with it. In terms of other data requirements across the globe, I'm just trying to think through a few.
Different regions, I suppose. Singapore has some financial related. SEC has, in the US, has some new with regards to reporting for ransomware, for it's just cybersecurity incidents. And so there's certain major cybersecurity incidents notified at 5 p.m. on a Friday afternoon after the markets have closed.
Which should always be a lot of fun. Yeah. Yeah, I know there's similar sorts of things for the Australian government to report things to the ACSC as well, which you get. So there's a lot of incident reporting that goes on there. I think in the financial sectors in Australia as well, there is a requirement to report certain incidents if they occur, if they hit certain dollar values and thresholds. I'm trying to think of the other. I know the Food and Drug Administration over in the US, the FDA, they've got a lot more requirements coming in now, particularly around medical devices and medical device testing requirements. So the SBOMs, I think they've actually just enhanced their guidance around those and the software bill of material requirements. So those are often some interest.
There's a lot more recalls from what I hear for software vendors that are going to be working with the government that they need to be producing SBOMs, software bill of materials, to as a requirement these days, just to be able to work with the federal government. So there's a bit of a mad scramble to get SOC 2 compliant in some organizations, and that's a type of certification, SOC 2, as we've been talking. And so there's definitely a bit more driver for organizations in the US to apply cybersecurity standards to their organizations.
Yeah, across the board. And I suppose for anyone listening that does want to enter that US market, maybe they are a software vendor. The big ones that seem to be driving a lot of that is end of life and management of the piece of software throughout its life cycle. So a lot of what is trying to be understood is, how is this software going to be kept updated? What happens if vulnerabilities or bugs are found? Who's managing it? How quickly can it be patched? How's it going to be notified? Basically, they're trying to avoid surprises and particularly also trying to ensure a level of longevity. So don't have something that's only going to live for potentially 2 years, possibly less. Really, they want to get some longevity out of it.
Yeah, I think they're now requiring security updates for 7 or 8 years for technology in the US now. Europe as well. Different organizations, different regulations, requirements. That's and a right to repair. So the Apple iPhones are starting to become more repairable, associated with that too. So not necessarily cybersecurity regulations, but there's things that vendors need to be aware of from a regulations perspective.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing with cyber as well. It's still, as much as it's out there, it's still a burgeoning industry, and it's still being more broadly understood. So I think that's where, like the FDA, for example, we don't necessarily relate them with cybersecurity, but it's an area that they've been given some form of governance over. And so I think that's what we'll start to see is more and more different regulators will be given different powers and will sort of be brought into the overall technology sphere as technology becomes further and further integrated with everyday life.
I saw a great analogy as a presentation not too long ago, and it was associated with the current state of software is similar to the current state, the state of food production in the US during the 1930s. There weren't any regulations for food and food administration, and so basically you could call anything food or medicine, and you could sell it.
It all counts.
And it all counted. And so when people started dying for various things like putting paint thinner in something and then calling it a drink, and for example, but that's the sort of things that there were food requirements that came in and food regulations that came in, and there were all this response to by people saying, "Oh, it's going to change. Oh, we're not going to be able to produce food anymore. It's overreach by big government." And there's a lot of echoes to that, to where software is right now, and pushback from people saying, "Oh, we need to be cyber compliant, not necessarily try big government overreach, etc., etc."
Yeah, how can they force us to keep something updated for 7 years?
Exactly. So yeah, there's definitely a bit more of a echo of the past in certain ways. So I also heard that one story that not too long ago, when safety was an issue in work sites, and then it became a requirement for boards to be accountable for the safety of their employees, and that was just before that occurred in Australia. There was that sort of environment was the sort of environment that we were going through a couple of years ago. And so it was getting to the point where, oh, you mean we need to be accountable for the cyber of our products?
Yeah. Which is kind of wild. It is, though. It's a new thing for boards. It's just like, you mean I need to be a cybersecurity expert? And it's like, well, not necessarily, but surprise, you are actually accountable. And if someone does break into your network and steal hundreds of people's worth of financial data or even their personal information, be prepared for some questions.
Definitely going to be some questions. So what best practices can organizations follow to ensure that they meet the compliance with these cybersecurity regulations? What would you advise to organizations to make sure that they actually meet the requirements?
So in terms of the requirements, it'd probably come back to that core principle of what is the requirement actually trying to get you to do. So if you consider, let's take privacy, for example, you might want to make someone's personal data your crown jewel. And so if it's like, right, we have this database full of people's personal information or financial information, whatever it might be, what are the risks to it? So again, go through and look at those threats and look at the risks to it. So how likely is it that someone can get in based on your design? And then put appropriate controls in place. So look at, can you de-identify the information once it's input? Are you able to actually segment it off? So again, do some segmentation in your network, put it behind the DMZ, like that. I'm trying to think of some of the other ones, but even then, can you block access to it for everyone but a select group of employees and just mitigate it out? So it's really going to depend on, again, how many people need to have access to it and what exactly it is that you're doing with the data, but really consider, why do I need to have this personal information? What are we doing with it? And therefore, how do I need to protect it? And that's probably the most important ones, is what are you actually doing and who are you trying to protect things from? And
that will lead to them ideally meeting the requirements that they have for the compliance for these regulations, is not just looking for another box to tick, but the intent and applying the common sense, I suppose, good sense surrounding applying the principles of the intent.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of the things that I've seen is, what would a reasonable person do? So if you were a reasonable person, and if it was, your information, would you be happy that these were the controls in place and this was the protection I did, and therefore I feel that the data is protected?
There's a roaring bushfire coming down the hill. What would a reasonable person do? Stay at home and
Bust out your hose?
or leave? Yeah, that's a good question. Given that we're coming into bushfire season in the next few months.
Yeah, it's coming up on towards December, unfortunately. But yeah, it's a hard one sometimes. Because particularly sometimes being reasonable isn't that simple. But yeah, it really is. Consider what the framework is asking of you and really look at what is it actually driving at in terms of its intent. And if you make a reasonable effort and you actually try to meet the intent of it, because again, you may not necessarily be able to exactly tick every box, but provided that you have done absolutely everything you can to meet the intent of the controls, then you really have done the best you can to comply.
Very good. Best that you can to comply is definitely a good target.
Yeah.
So basically, I'd like to thank you very much for your time. And I thank you for coming onto the program. We've definitely had a great talk about governance, risk and compliance, controls, risks, and threat actors and protecting organizations. So I'd really like to thank you for coming onto the program and look forward to enjoying the rest of B-Sides Canberra.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me on. Thanks.
Thank you.
Great.